5 SUVs worth $350,000 stuck axle deep in my cattle pasture on a Sunday morning. A white Tahoe, a Range Rover, an Escalade, a Yukon, a Navigator, all of them sunk in stock ponds I dug myself, surrounded by trespassing signs they drove past, recorded by 6 cameras they didn't know existed. The HOA president stood barefoot in the mud. She'd lost both shoes, screaming at the sheriff to arrest me. The sheriff looked at my deed, looked at my permits, and pulled out 5 citation pads. She'd spent months driving through my land, ripped down my signs, had my gate destroyed, filed false complaints with the EPA and 3 county departments. When none of it worked, she organized a convoy to prove it was a public road. 5 cars proved one thing: she picked the wrong rancher. I'm a former hydraulic engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers. I know how soil holds, how water moves, and exactly how much mud it takes to stop a $60,000 Tahoe dead in its tracks. This is that story. The first thing that hits you when you drive through the front gate of the Ellison Ranch is the smell. Cedar and limestone dust, and something green and alive that you can't quite name. 280 acres of hill country pasture, stretching in every direction, dotted with live oaks so old their branches touch the ground. My family bought this land in 1961. My grandfather ran cattle here. My father ran cattle here, and now I do. My name's Garrett Ellison. 2 years ago, I walked away from an 18-year career as a hydraulic engineer with the Army Corps of Engineers to come home and keep a promise. My father, Ray Ellison, spent his last 4 months in a hospital bed in Fredericksburg with tubes in his arms and a view of a parking lot. The cancer took his lungs first, then his voice, then everything else. But the last thing he said to me was this: "Don't let anybody take this land, son. It's all we got left." So I came home, sold my apartment in San Antonio, traded blueprints for fence posts. Every morning I'd step onto that porch, watch 60 Herefords moving through the South Pasture, and feel something I hadn't felt in years. Like the ground under my boots actually belonged to me. The trouble started with the subdivision next door. 12 years back, my father sold 40 acres on the east side to a developer named Clint Hargrove. Hargrove scraped the cedar, poured foundations, and built 127 houses he called the Ridges at Copper Creek. From my pasture, you could see the terracotta rooftops behind white vinyl fencing, like a row of overpriced dollhouses. And running the whole show was Tammy Prescott. 52 years old, platinum blonde hair that never moved regardless of wind speed, and a wardrobe built entirely around linen blazers worn over yoga pants she clearly never did yoga in. She drove a pearl white Tahoe with a vanity plate that read RIDGQN, Ridge Queen. Her husband, Wade Prescott, was Hargrove's business partner. So Tammy didn't just run the HOA. She married into the developer's pocket and turned neighborhood governance into her personal throne room. 8 years as president, 0 contested elections. The kind of authority that only exists because nobody's bothered to challenge it yet. The first time I met her, she pulled into my driveway uninvited, stepped out in white linen and Gucci sunglasses, and looked at my barn like it personally offended her. "I hope you understand this neighborhood has standards, Mr. Ellison." I told her this wasn't a neighborhood, it was a ranch. She smiled the way people smile when they've already decided you're beneath them, and drove off. Here's what Tammy had been doing while my father was too sick to stop her. There's an old ranch road that cuts across the back pasture. Dirt and gravel, maybe 3/4 of a mile, connecting the property to County Road 114. My father used it for equipment access. Occasionally, he let a neighbor cut through as a courtesy, but it was never a public road, never registered, never maintained by the county. Tammy turned it into her personal highway, 5 to 7 SUVs a day. The ruts were 8 inches deep. They knocked down my temporary fencing twice. 3 cows got spooked into a barbed wire line and needed vet treatment. So I put up 4 signs, steel posts, red letters, private property, no trespassing. 3 days later, all 4 were gone. One had been bent in half and shoved back into the dirt upside down. When I asked Tammy, she didn't blink. Those signs were blocking community access. I had them removed for everyone's safety. She said it like she was doing me a favor, like she'd cleaned up trash on my own land. That's when I understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was systematic, and Tammy Prescott was the general. I decided to make it harder to ignore. I drove to the supply yard in Johnson City and bought a 16-foot ranch gate. Heavy gauge, steel tubing, powder-coated black. The kind of gate that says, this property has an owner, and that owner isn't playing around. I picked up 2 steel posts, 4 bags of Quikrete, a heavy-duty chain, and a padlock the size of my fist. Total cost? $1,400. Money I didn't really have to spare, but cheaper than replacing fencing every 2 weeks. I spent the next Saturday setting it up. Dug the post holes 3 feet deep with a manual auger because the tractor attachment was down for maintenance. Poured the concrete. Let it cure overnight. Welded the hinges myself with the little MIG unit my father kept in the shop. The sparks hissed and popped in the late afternoon heat, and the smell of hot metal mixed with the dry cedar air until the whole back pasture smelled like an ironworks. By Sunday evening, the gate stood solid across the ranch road. Chained. Locked. Done. And because I'm not stupid, I mounted a stealth cam trail camera on the nearest fence post, aimed it straight at the gate, motion activated, infrared night vision. I wanted a record of whatever happened next. What happened next took exactly 47 hours. Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the camera app. I opened it and watched the footage in real time from my kitchen table. There was Tammy Prescott, standing in front of my gate in a cream-colored blazer, pointing like a museum director who'd found a painting she didn't approve of. Behind her, 2 men in work boots and high-vis vests were pulling an angle grinder out of a truck bed. "Cut it off," she said, loud enough for the camera mic to pick up. "This gate is illegal, and it's coming down today." The first guy knelt at the bottom hinge. The grinder screamed. Orange sparks sprayed across the dirt like tiny fireworks at the world's worst celebration. Within 3 minutes, they'd cut both hinges. The gate fell sideways and hit the ground with a sound that carried across the pasture, a deep, flat clang that scattered the cattle and made my jaw tighten from 200 yards away. $1,400 of steel lying in the dust. Tammy didn't even glance back. She stepped over the downed gate, got into her Tahoe, and drove through my pasture like she'd just cleared a minor inconvenience from her morning commute. I replayed the video 3 times, paused on the 2 workers, zoomed in on the truck, and that's when I noticed the logo on the door. Prescott and Hargrove Development LLC, Wade Prescott's company. Her own husband had sent his crew to destroy my property. Now here's something most people don't know. In Texas, criminal mischief, which is the legal term for intentionally destroying someone else's property, becomes a state jail felony when the damage exceeds $2,500. That's Texas Penal Code Section 28.03. My gate, the concrete posts, the welding work, and the camera they blocked with a vest during the cut, all together, well north of that threshold. A state jail felony carries up to 2 years. But I didn't call the sheriff. Not yet. One incident is a complaint. A pattern is a prosecution. And I had a feeling Tammy Prescott was just getting warmed up. I drove to her house the next morning, rang the bell. She opened the door barefoot, holding a glass of something green that probably cost more per ounce than my diesel fuel. She looked at me the way a hotel manager looks at a guest who won't leave the lobby. "Oh, Mr. Ellison, can I help you?" "Your husband's crew cut down my gate," I said. "I have it on camera." She didn't flinch, didn't blush, didn't even shift her weight. That gate was blocking a community road. I did everyone a favor. "It's not a community road, Tammy. It's my pasture." She tilted her head, the way you tilt your head at a child who doesn't understand a simple concept. "We'll let the county decide that, won't we?" And she closed the door. Not a slam. Just a slow, deliberate push. Like she was sealing an envelope she'd already addressed. I stood there for a second. The smell of her perfume, heavy, sweet, artificial magnolia, hung on the doorframe like a cologne stain. Everything about that woman was manufactured. The hair, the smile, the authority. I walked back to my truck and sat for a minute with my hands on the wheel. She wasn't going to stop. That much was clear. But neither was I. The difference between us was that she ran on entitlement. I ran on engineering. And engineers don't guess. We measure. we calculate, and we build things that hold. 2 weeks after the gate incident, I opened my mailbox and found an envelope with the Ridges at Copper Creek logo embossed in gold. Inside was a 3-page letter on heavy stock paper, signed by Tammy Prescott, President, Board of Directors. The letter informed me, and I'm going to try to say this without laughing, that my cattle ranch fell within something called the Extended Aesthetic Zone of the Ridges at Copper Creek, and that I was therefore subject to the community's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Specifically, I was in violation of Article 7, Section 3, which prohibited agricultural equipment, livestock containment structures, or odor-producing operations visible from any community residence. My family had been running cattle on this land since Lyndon Johnson was in the Senate. The Ridges didn't exist until 2012. And this woman was trying to tell me my cows were an aesthetic violation? I put the letter on the kitchen counter and poured myself a coffee. There's a certain kind of crazy that doesn't deserve anger. It deserves patience. Because crazy, given enough rope, always hangs itself. The next week, the inspectors started showing up. First came the water quality guy from the county environmental office. He tested my stock tanks, my well, and the runoff channel near the south pasture. Everything passed. He shook my hand, told me my operation was cleaner than most, and drove off. 2 days later, a fencing and livestock containment inspector knocked on my door. He walked the perimeter, checked my barbed wire tension, inspected my squeeze chute, and confirmed everything met USDA standards. Passed. 3 days after that, a hazardous materials inspector arrived to check my fertilizer storage. I showed him the locked shed where I kept 2 pallets of standard nitrogen blend. He scanned it, logged it, and closed the file. Passed. 3 inspections in 10 days. All clean. All triggered by complaints filed with the county. The inspector from the last visit, a guy named Doug, who looked like he'd been doing this since the Reagan administration, paused at his truck before leaving. He glanced around, then looked at me. "Look, Mr. Ellison, everything checks out. Your place is tight. But I gotta tell you, somebody's calling in complaints on you every other day. Same address, same language, same signature." "Let me guess," I said. "Tammy Prescott." Doug didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. His expression said everything his badge wouldn't let him. But Tammy wasn't done with just inspectors. She wanted bigger guns. The following week, she marched into the county commissioner's office and demanded an environmental impact assessment of my cattle operation. Her argument, delivered, I was later told, with the conviction of a woman who truly believes she's saving the planet, was that my cows were contaminating Copper Creek, the spring-fed stream that runs through both my property and the subdivision. The county agreed to test the water. They sent a team. They tested upstream, midstream, and downstream. Every sample came back clean. My cattle operation was not polluting anything. But here's the thing Tammy didn't know, and this is important. Texas has something called the Right to Farm Act, codified in the Texas Agriculture Code, Section 251.004. It says that if an agricultural operation existed before a residential development was built nearby, the residents of that development cannot file nuisance complaints against the farm. Period. My ranch predates the Ridges by over 50 years. Legally, Tammy had as much standing to complain about my cows as she did to complain about the weather. I filed a copy of the statute with the county clerk's office, just to make sure it was on record. Evenings were the hardest part. After the inspectors left and the paperwork was filed and the cows were fed, I'd sit on the porch with a glass of water and stare at the tree line where the subdivision lights bled into the sky like a cheap sunset. 3 weeks of inspections, 3 weeks of paperwork, 3 weeks of a woman with a clipboard and a grudge trying to regulate a ranch that was here before her HOA was a blueprint. I thought about my father. He used to sit in this exact chair. He'd watch the same stars come out over the same pasture and say things that didn't make sense until years later. One of them was this: "The land doesn't fight back, son, but the man who knows the land can." I didn't fully understand that yet, but I was starting to. The cease and desist letter arrived on a Thursday. Whitmore and Keene, attorneys at law, Austin, Texas. 3 pages of dense legal language that boiled down to one demand. I had 30 days to restore unimpeded community access across my pasture or face a lawsuit to establish a prescriptive easement. For those of you who haven't dealt with property law, a prescriptive easement is basically legal squatting for roads. If someone uses a path across your land openly, continuously, and without your permission for 10 years in Texas, they can petition the court to make that access permanent. It's one of the oldest tricks in property law, and Tammy's lawyers were betting everything on it. I read the letter twice, set it down, poured a glass of water, and then I smiled. Because I already knew something her lawyers clearly didn't bother to check. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before the legal threat, Tammy had already opened a second front. She called a special meeting at the Ridges Clubhouse. Thursday evening, 7 o'clock, mandatory attendance for all homeowners. I wasn't invited, obviously. But Nolan Briggs was. Nolan was a retired electrician who'd moved into the Ridges 2 years earlier and somehow managed to keep his common sense intact despite living inside Tammy's jurisdiction. He texted me the next morning with a full report. 60 people showed up, Nolan wrote. Tammy stood at the front with a projector and gave a 20-minute presentation about how you're threatening community safety and access. She had photos of your gate, your signs, and your fence line. She called your ranch a rural hazard adjacent to a family community. Then she passed around a petition. 47 residents signed it. The petition asked the county to impose a prescriptive easement across my land, claiming continuous community use for over a decade. Nolan didn't sign. When Tammy asked why, he said, "I moved here 2 years ago, Tammy. That road was there before any of us. It's his land." Tammy looked at him the way a queen looks at a jester who forgot his place. "Then maybe you should move somewhere with lower standards." Nolan said. 3 people laughed. 40 others looked at the floor. That's how power works in a place like the Ridges. You don't challenge the crown. You just hope she doesn't notice you. Then came the animal control call. On a Monday morning, an officer from the County Animal Services Department pulled up to my front gate and told me he'd received a formal complaint that my cattle were aggressive, unsecured, and a danger to pedestrians and children. I walked him to the south pasture and let him see for himself. 60 Hereford cows, the most docile breed in the American cattle industry, standing in the grass, chewing cud, looking at us like we were mildly interesting furniture. One of them, a cow my father had named Biscuit, walked up to the officer and licked his hand. The officer looked at me, looked at Biscuit, looked back at me. "Mr. Ellison, I've been doing this job for 22 years. These are the gentlest cattle I've ever inspected. Whoever filed this complaint either doesn't know what a cow is or doesn't care." He paused. Then he added something I wasn't expecting. "You know, sir, if the same person keeps filing reports that don't check out, you have the right to pursue a frivolous complaint action under the Texas Government Code. Just something to keep in mind." I thanked him and wrote it down. That night I sat at the desk in my father's old office, now my office, surrounded by complaint copies, cease and desist letters, photos of destroyed gates, and a growing file of trail camera footage. The desk lamp threw a circle of yellow light across the papers, while the rest of the room stayed dark. My coffee had gone cold an hour ago. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the walls cooling down after a hot day. I opened my laptop and navigated to the county clerk's digital records portal. Property deeds, development permits, drainage plans, easement filings. I'd spent 18 years reading engineering documents for the federal government. If there was something buried in these records, I'd find it. And I did. About 2 hours in, my cursor stopped on a line I had to read 3 times before I believed it. "Well, I'll be damned," I said to nobody. What I found changed everything. The county records told a story that Tammy Prescott never wanted anyone to read. I started with the deed. When my father sold those 40 acres to Clint Hargrove in 2012, the sale contract included a clause in Article 4, Paragraph 9, that read, and I'll never forget this language, "No public or private easement, whether express, implied, or by necessity, is granted across the remaining Ellison parcel as part of this transaction." My father's attorney had written that in. My father had signed it. Hargrove had signed it. The county recorder had stamped it. There was no easement. There had never been an easement. The old ranch road was, and always had been, a private path on private land. But it got better. Tammy's lawyers were pushing for a prescriptive easement, the argument that continuous use for 10 years creates a legal right. In Texas, that clock only ticks if the use is uninterrupted. One significant break in access resets the whole timeline. And guess what my father did in 2016, 4 years after the subdivision was built? He put up a temporary gate and chained it shut for 3 months during calving season. I found the photos on his old laptop. Gate up, chain on, dated April through June 2016. The prescriptive easement claim was dead before it was ever filed. That alone would have been enough, but what I found next made me sit back in my chair and just stare at the ceiling for a long time. The Ridges at Copper Creek was built under a stormwater drainage permit issued by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ. That permit required the developer to install 2 retention ponds and a system of bioswales along the western boundary to manage runoff from 127 impervious rooftops and driveways. Standard procedure, required by law, non-negotiable. I pulled up the construction completion records. The retention ponds were never built. The bioswales were never installed. The entire stormwater management system existed only on paper. For 12 years, every drop of rain that hit those rooftops and driveways had been flowing downhill, straight onto my pasture. That's why the ground along the old ranch road was always soft. That's why my stock tanks overflowed after moderate rain. That's why the drainage channel near the south fence had been eroding. It wasn't natural. It was engineering negligence on a massive scale. And here's where it got personal. The drainage permit application was signed by 2 people, Clint Hargrove, developer, and Wade Prescott, project manager, Tammy's husband. Wade had signed off on a drainage plan that was never executed, and for 12 years he'd been collecting partnership profits from a subdivision that was actively violating state environmental law. If TCEQ opened an investigation, the fines alone could hit $25,000 per day of violation. Do the math on 12 years. Tammy wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She wasn't fighting for, quote, community access. She was building a wall of noise and distraction to keep anyone from looking too closely at the land she and her husband were quietly profiting from. The trespassing, the complaints, the inspections, the legal threats, all of it was a smokescreen. She wasn't a crusader. She was a cover-up artist wearing Gucci sunglasses. I closed the laptop, walked outside, stood on the porch and listened to the crickets for a while. The sky was wide and black, and full of more stars than Tammy Prescott had complaints. For the first time since coming home, I felt something shift. Not anger, something quieter, something more useful. The feeling you get when you realize your opponent has been playing checkers while you've been reading the rule book for chess. The next morning I drove 40 minutes to the county seat and walked into the law office of Hank Overstreet. Hank was 61 years old, built like a fence post, and had been handling land disputes in the hill country since before I was born. His office smelled like old leather and printer toner, and every flat surface was covered in legal pads filled with handwriting so precise it could have been typed. I laid out my file on his desk: deed records, trail camera footage, complaint copies, the cease and desist letter, the drainage permit, and the construction completion records. Hank read for 20 minutes without saying a word. Then he looked up at me over his reading glasses and said something I'll never forget. "Garrett, you don't just have a trespassing case. You've got a fraud case. These people built a subdivision without installing the required drainage infrastructure. They've been dumping runoff onto your land for 12 years, and the HOA president's husband signed the permit application. That's not negligence. That's knowing." We built the strategy in layers. Layer 1. A civil lawsuit for trespassing and property damage. The gate, the fencing, the vet bills for the injured cows, the pasture damage from vehicle traffic. Documented, photographed, and time-stamped by trail cameras. Layer 2. A formal complaint to TCEQ regarding the missing stormwater infrastructure. If TCEQ confirmed the violation, the developer and Wade Prescott would face mandatory remediation and fines that could reach 6 figures. Layer 3. A request for a county audit of all development permits issued to Hargrove's company. If the drainage was skipped, what else was cut? "When do we file?" I asked. Hank folded his reading glasses. "Not yet. Let them make one more move. The bigger the trespass, the bigger the judgment.
So I did what I do best.
I engineered. I rented a Kubota KX040 mini excavator from the equipment yard in Dripping Springs and hauled it to the back pasture on a flatbed. Over the next 5 days, working sunrise to sunset, I dug 4 stock ponds along the path of the old ranch road. Each pond was roughly 20 by 30 feet and 4 feet deep. I also cut 2 drainage berms across the road itself, 6 feet wide, 2 feet deep, angled to channel water into the ponds. Here's the thing most people don't realize about agricultural water management. In Texas, under the Texas Water Code, Section 11.142, a landowner has the absolute right to construct stock ponds and drainage structures on their own property for agricultural purposes, without a special permit, as long as the structures don't impound water from a state waterway. My ponds collected rainfall and subdivision runoff. They didn't touch Copper Creek. Completely legal.
But I wasn't just digging holes.
I was applying 18 years of hydraulic engineering to the problem. I knew hill country clay. When it's dry, it's hard as concrete. When it's wet, it turns into a substance with roughly the consistency of warm butter. My stock ponds were designed with sloped entry edges and flat clay bottoms that would hold water after any rain event. The surface would green over with grass within 2 to 3 weeks. From 50 feet away, they'd look like slightly low patches in an otherwise normal pasture. But any vehicle weighing over 4,000 pounds on standard road tires would sink to the axles within seconds. The smell of freshly turned earth filled the back pasture for days. Red-orange hill country clay piled along the pond edges like construction wounds waiting to heal. I shaped every berm, graded every slope, and checked every angle. By the end of the week, the old ranch road was gone. In its place were 4 legitimate agricultural water features and 2 functional drainage channels. I upgraded the camera system too. 6 stealth cams, motion activated, positioned to cover every pond and berm from multiple angles. Night vision, cloud backup. I also welded new trespassing signs. Steel plate, red paint, bolted defense posts with tamper-resistant hardware. Nobody was ripping these down without an impact wrench. Then I waited. But I didn't have to wait long. 3 days after I finished, Nolan Briggs sent me a text that made my week. Heads up, Tammy's planning something called a community access drive. She wants 5 cars to drive through your pasture this Sunday to prove it's a public road. She sent an email to the whole HOA. I read the message twice. Looked out the window at the back pasture, where 4 stock ponds were already turning green. Checked the weather forecast. Rain expected Saturday evening. I called Hank. She's coming Sunday, with friends. Hank didn't miss a beat. Good. Letter. Tammy saw me digging. I knew she would. The back pasture is visible from County Road 114, and Tammy Prescott drove that road like it was her personal surveillance route. She pulled her Tahoe onto the shoulder on a Wednesday afternoon, climbed out with her phone, and started taking pictures of me on the Kubota, like I was committing a crime in broad daylight. She stood there for 10 minutes, blazer flapping in the wind, sunglasses catching the sun, snapping photos like a real estate agent documenting water damage at an open house. That night, she called Wade. I know this because of what happened next. 2 days later, I got a call from the TCEQ field office in San Marcos. A tip had been filed alleging that I was dumping construction waste on my property and contaminating the groundwater. The caller, anonymous of course, described large-scale excavation and illegal landfill activity on a cattle ranch adjacent to a residential community. The inspector arrived on Friday morning. A woman named Sandra Polk, mid-40s, clipboard in one hand, soil testing kit in the other. She was polite, professional, and clearly skeptical of whatever she'd been told on the phone. I walked her through the property, showed her each stock pond, explained the agricultural purpose, showed her the drainage berms and how they channeled surface water away from the pasture low points. She tested the soil in 3 locations and the water in 2 ponds, all clean, no contaminants, no construction waste, no illegal anything. "Mr. Ellison," she said, closing her clipboard, "these are well-designed retention features, actually better than what most ranchers build. Your background in hydraulic engineering shows. Thank you, I said. 18 years of federal service has to be good for something. She paused at her truck, looked back toward the subdivision. One more thing. I noticed your property sits downslope from that development. Has stormwater runoff been an issue for you? I could have played it cool, but the truth was more useful. It's been an issue for 12 years. I handed her a copy of the original drainage permit for the ridges, the one requiring retention ponds and bioswales that were never built. She took it, read it, and her expression changed the way a doctor's expression changes when the X-ray shows something the patient hasn't been told about yet.
We'll be looking into this, she said,
and drove off. Tammy had just called in an environmental inspection on me. And that inspection had opened the door to an investigation of her own husband's development company. I stood in my pasture and watched the TCEQ truck disappear down County Road 114 and felt something close to poetic justice. But Tammy wasn't done. People like her never are. When the government route didn't work, she went digital. That weekend, a post appeared on the Copper Creek Community Next Door page. Tammy Prescott, verified resident, writing under her real name with the confidence of a woman who had never been wrong about anything in her life. Alert. Local rancher deliberately sabotaging community access road. He has dug trenches and pits designed to trap vehicles and injure residents. This is dangerous, illegal, and an act of aggression against our families. I'm urging everyone to call the county and demand action. Our children use that road. The comments split in half. Half the neighborhood rallied behind Tammy. Call the sheriff and sue him. And this is why we have an HOA. The other half asked the one question Tammy couldn't answer. Wait, is it actually his land? Nolan Briggs, bless him, posted a response. I looked it up. There's no recorded easement. The ranch road is on private property. Maybe we should stop driving through someone else's field. Tammy deleted Nolan's comment within the hour. Then she blocked him from the group. Then she posted a follow-up. Anyone who sides with the rancher over this community isn't welcome at our next meeting. I read the whole thread on my phone, standing in the kitchen with the cold blue light of the screen washing over my face and the refrigerator humming behind me like the only witness. Tammy was building a mob. But mobs only work when the cause is just. And the cause here was 5 women demanding the right to drive luxury SUVs through someone else's cow pasture. The email came the next morning. Nolan forwarded it without comment. Dear Ridges residents, this Sunday at 8 a.m., we are taking back our road. 5 vehicles minimum. We drive through the pasture together, park at the other end, take photographs, and document everything for our legal filing. This is about our property rights. This is about standing up. Tammy Prescott, President. 5 confirmed drivers. Denise Waverly in her white Range Rover. Brenda Faulkner in her silver Escalade. Sheila Colton in her black Yukon. Pam Rutherford in her champagne Lincoln Navigator. And Tammy in the pearl white Tahoe. Combined vehicle value, somewhere north of $350,000. I called Hank. Can you have the civil complaint ready to file Monday morning? Already drafted, he said. Have a good weekend, Garrett. Saturday evening came in slow, the way Texas evenings do when the heat finally breaks and the sky turns the color of a bruise. I sat on the porch with a glass of water and watched the clouds stack up from the southwest. Dark ones, the kind that mean business. By 6 o'clock, the first drops hit the tin roof of the equipment shed. Fat drops, heavy, the kind that sound like someone tapping pennies on sheet metal. Within 30 minutes, it was a full downpour, steady, soaking rain that turned the pasture into a glistening dark green carpet and filled every low point on the property. I knew exactly what was happening under that grass. 4 stock ponds filling with rainwater, the clay bottoms sealing tight, the surface turning to the kind of mud that grabs things and doesn't let go. The drainage berms channeling runoff across the old road path, softening every square foot of ground that used to be hard-packed dirt. By morning, the top 18 inches of soil along that entire stretch would have the bearing capacity of wet cake. The rain stopped around 10. I went inside, set an alarm for 5:30, and slept better than I had in months. Sunday morning, 5:30, still dark. I stood at the kitchen counter and made coffee while the sky outside turned from black to purple to the pale gray blue of a hill country dawn. The air smelled like wet grass and ozone, that clean, electric smell that only comes after a hard rain. I checked my phone. All 6 cameras online. Battery levels full. Cloud sync confirmed. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my binoculars, and walked the ADV out to the back pasture for one final check. The ground looked perfect, and I mean that in both senses. It looked like normal pasture, green, wet, freshly rained on, the way every field in the county looked that morning. But when I stepped off the ATV and pressed my boot into the soil near stock pond number 2, my foot sank 3 inches before I even put my full weight down. A heavy SUV on standard all-season tires would go through this like a bowling ball into pudding. I moved the cattle to the south pasture. Didn't want them stressed. Latched the gate behind them and watched Biscuit, my father's favorite cow, amble through the wet grass without a care in the world. At least somebody was having a relaxing morning. Back at the house, I checked the new trespassing signs. All 6 still in place. Steel plate, red paint, bolted flush. Then I positioned myself on the porch with my coffee, my phone, and a clear line of sight to the back pasture through the binoculars. 7:45. A white Tahoe appeared on County Road 114, then a white Range Rover, silver Escalade, black Yukon, Champagne Navigator. 5 luxury SUVs lined up at the edge of my property, like a very expensive bad decision waiting to happen. I watched through the binoculars. Tammy got out first. Cream blazer, white pants, sunglasses that cost more than my monthly feed bill. She was holding a clipboard and talking with her hands, the way she always did when she wanted to feel important. The other 4 women gathered around her in a half circle, nodding like the backup singers at a concert nobody bought tickets to. I could hear Tammy's voice from across the pasture when the wind shifted. Not her exact words, but the tone, that sharp, instructional, "this is how it's going to be" cadence that had been running the ridges for 8 years. She pointed at the pasture, pointed at the road on the other side, gave her orders. Single file, stay on the old track, drive through, park at the far end, document everything. One of them, Denise, I think, asked something. The wind carried a fragment. What if he calls the cops? Tammy's response was loud enough to hear clearly. Let him. We have 47 signatures saying this is a community road. He can't do a thing. I picked up my phone and dialed the sheriff's department. Dale, this is Garrett Ellison, out on County Road 114. I've got 5 vehicles about to trespass on my posted private property. They're at the south fence line right now. Sheriff Dale Compton was quiet for a second. Then he said, "How long till they're on your land?" "About 2 minutes. I'll be there in 15. I hung up, poured a second cup of coffee, sat down, and watched Tammy Prescott climb into her pearl white Tahoe and lead her little convoy through my fence line, past my signs, and straight into the back pasture. This was going to be a good morning. Tammy's Tahoe hit the first stock pond at about 15 miles an hour. The front tires crossed the grass edge and dropped like they'd found a trap door. The hood dipped forward, the engine revved, the rear wheels spun, and then the whole vehicle just stopped, sank, settled into the clay like a white whale beaching itself in slow motion. 6 inches, 12 inches, 18 inches. Red-brown mud swallowed the tires up to the wheel wells, and the undercarriage groaned against the wet earth with a sound like a ship's hull dragging on a sandbar. Tammy gunned the engine. That was her first mistake. Any engineer will tell you, when you're stuck in saturated clay, acceleration is not your friend. The spinning tires liquefied the mud underneath and turned a stuck vehicle into a buried one. The Tahoe dropped another 4 inches. The tailpipe went under. The engine coughed, stuttered, and died. I watched it through binoculars from my porch. Coffee still warm. Behind her, Denise Waverly saw the Tahoe stop and tried to go around. She swung her white Range Rover 30 feet to the right, off the old track, and straight into stock pond number 2. Her left tires hit the soft edge at an angle, and the vehicle tilted sideways like a dog cocking its head at something confusing. She hit the gas. The Range Rover lurched forward 6 feet and then sank to the running boards. $92,000 of British engineering sitting crooked in Texas mud. Brenda Faulkner, in the silver Escalade, saw what was happening and hit the brakes. but she was already on the soft ground between the two ponds. Her rear wheels slid sideways into the drainage berm. The Escalade came to a slow, humiliating stop at a 45-degree angle, like a shopping cart someone had abandoned in a ditch. The mud grabbed the tires and held on, like it had been waiting for this moment all year.
Sheila Colton panicked.
She threw her black Yukon into reverse and floored it. The rear tires dug 2 channels in the wet clay, deep enough to lose a boot in. The Yukon didn't move backward, it moved down. The frame kissed the mud, and that was that. Pam Rutherford, the last in line, driving the Champagne Navigator, tried the smartest move of any of them. She attempted a full U-turn, but the ground under her front wheels had been softened by 12 years of subdivision runoff and 4 inches of fresh rain. The steering wheel went light. The Navigator slid sideways into the second drainage berm and came to rest with its front bumper pointed at the sky and its dignity pointed at the ground. 5 luxury SUVs, $350,000 combined, all of them buried in legal stock ponds on private property, surrounded by posted trespassing signs and 6 cameras recording every angle in high definition.
Tammy stood in the pasture,
Barefoot. Her white pants were brown to the knee. Her cream blazer had a mud streak across the sleeve. One of her Gucci sunglasses lenses was smeared with clay. She was screaming into her phone.
"He set traps. He dug traps in a public road to destroy our cars. I want him arrested. I want him in handcuffs. Send someone right now."
Sheriff Dale Compton arrived 12 minutes later in a county patrol truck. He parked on the gravel shoulder of County Road 114, stepped out, and looked across the pasture at the scene in front of him. 5 SUVs, 5 women standing in mud, 1 rancher on a porch with a coffee cup. Dale walked over to me first. I handed him an envelope. Inside, a certified copy of the property deed showing no easement. A copy of the county surveyor's report confirming the road was entirely on Ellison land. 6 stills from the trail cameras showing the vehicles passing posted signs. A copy of the TCEQ agricultural activity permit covering the stock ponds, and a printout of Tammy's email organizing the community access drive.
Dale read it all.
Looked at the signs, looked at the vehicles, looked at Tammy, who was marching toward us through the mud like a general whose army had just surrendered without her permission.
"Sheriff, I demand you arrest this man. He deliberately—"
"Mrs. Prescott." Dale's voice was calm, flat, and final. "There is no easement on this land. These stock ponds are permitted agricultural improvements on private property. Your vehicles passed clearly posted no trespassing signs. What I'm looking at is 5 counts of criminal trespass." He pulled out his citation pad. Tammy's face went from red to white faster than a traffic light. 5 citations. 5 towing fees at $400 each. And 1 photographer from the Copper Creek County Tribune, Luann Caldwell, who arrived just in time to capture the money shot. 5 luxury SUVs sunk axle-deep in a cattle pasture, their drivers standing barefoot in the mud, holding trespassing citations like participation trophies for the world's worst road trip.
Tammy saw the camera and screamed,
"You can't print this. This is private." Luann lowered her camera just long enough to respond. "You're on someone else's private property, ma'am. That's kind of the whole story." The photo made the front page. The headline read, 5 SUVs trapped on rancher's pasture after HOA president organizes mass trespass. Below it, a wide shot of 5 mud-caked vehicles and 1 very clean rancher leaning against his truck in the background, coffee in hand, not saying a word. The fallout came fast. Within 2 weeks, the Ridges at Copper Creek held an emergency HOA meeting. This time, I didn't need Nolan to tell me what happened. The results were public record. Tammy Prescott was removed as president by a vote of 94-7. 8 years of unchallenged authority erased in a single ballot. She walked out of the clubhouse without a word. No speech, no defense, no cream blazer. Just a woman in a gray sweatshirt crossing a parking lot, with her head down for the first time since anyone could remember. Nolan told me one detail I'll never forget. As Tammy reached her Tahoe, freshly detailed after the mud incident, probably cost her $500, Nolan was standing by the door. He looked at her and said, quietly, "Should have just used the main exit, Tammy." She didn't respond, didn't even look at him, just got in and drove away, through the subdivision's main entrance. for the first time in years. The TCEQ investigation into the ridge's stormwater violations opened 1 month later. Inspectors confirmed what I'd found in the records. The required retention ponds and bioswales had never been built. 12 years of unmanaged runoff from 127 homes, flowing across my land unchecked. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality issued a combined penalty of $180,000 against Hargrove Development LLC and ordered full remediation within 12 months. Wade Prescott, as the project manager who signed the original drainage plan, was named individually in the enforcement action. His construction company lost 3 county contracts within 60 days. Turns out people don't want to hire a builder who skips the drainage and hopes nobody notices. My civil lawsuit settled 4 months later. Trespassing, property damage, destruction of the gate, injured cattle, pasture degradation. The 5 defendants, Tammy, Denise, Brenda, Sheila, and Pam, paid a combined $47,000. Tammy's share was the largest. Her attorney tried to argue the settlement was excessive. The judge looked at the trail camera footage of 5 SUVs driving past posted signs onto private land and said, "The footage speaks for itself, counselor." I used every dollar of that settlement to create something my father would have been proud of. The Ellison Agricultural Youth Fund, a scholarship for rural students pursuing degrees in agriculture, land management, or environmental science. $5,000 a year, renewable for 4 years, funded by the interest on the settlement plus matching donations from the County Agricultural Board. We held the launch ceremony on the ranch, on the back pasture, right where 5 SUVs had been stuck in the mud 3 months earlier. 40 people came. Neighbors, county officials, FFA kids from 3 local high schools, and a reporter from the Tribune who'd already written